Well, good day to you folks. Time to start our third session. And the way we'll do that, I'll try to, is the operative word, summarize a bit what was going on in the previous two sessions and introduce the material for the present session. And then we have with us a guest, a noted sociologist of religion, David Martin from London School of Economics, and we're delighted that you can be with us. And after my remarks, Professor Martin is going to make his remarks, and then we'll be followed by 25 minutes of discussion, take a break, and then reconvene to continue our discussion. So it's a kind of standard format that we will follow in this case as in previous ones as well. So now last week we talked about the stakes in getting the faith and globalization right. And we talked about the questions of relationship between the faiths and how they relate to one another, to each other as kind of sites of communal identity. A bit of reflection whether they're able to form more flexible identity that can engage others. Remember the phrase open versus closed that Tony Blair has consistently used. And then we talked about relationship between faiths, not so much among themselves, but in relationship to globalization. How are they, faiths, related to globalization processes? And in what ways might they contribute to humanizing globalization? We talked about this idea of pursuing flat meanings of decreasing pain and increasing pleasure through consumerism as one kind of default feature of globalization processes versus striving to achieve human flourishing within a compelling vision, overarching interpretation of reality. So relationship among faiths and then relation of faiths to globalization processes. Assumptions that we operated with is that faiths are able to form distinct but flexible identities and foster reconciliation. That's a major assumption. Whether that's correct or not remains to be seen. The other assumption was globalization processes do not contain in and of themselves a compelling vision of human flourishing. That too may be a contested assumption. And globalization processes may need to be supplied by cultural capital that comes from religious sources or from other overarching interpretation of life. Some open issues that we have touched upon and that have generated discussions and that remain as open issues, and I think that we have to attend to as the course unfolds. One issue was this: can exclusivist faiths foster reconciliation? Do not exclusivist religious commitments, and Yasser has mentioned a particular case of salvation only through Jesus Christ. Other religions have similar kinds of claims. Can such exclusivist religious claims be combined with social tolerance? And default position seems to be that religious exclusivism leads to social exclusivism. But is that sustained by data? That'll be interesting to explore. And if it is that an inherent position, or is that something that's acquired of religion by religions in a particular setting? Another issue that I think Tony Blair has raised was, can we distinguish between faith as a mere cultural resource and faith, I think he used the word spirituality, and maybe you can describe it as a kind of a deep commitment, even a commitment to a faith tradition, and surmise that in the case when faith functions merely as cultural resource, it may undermine reconciliation and indeed foster some conflict or deepen conflict. And in the second case, when it's a matter of deep spiritual commitment, that it may contain resources for overcoming conflicts. So those are some of the open issues. And then the open issue was, do globalization processes contain values? And in particular, values that align themselves well with human flourishing. I think that's also an issue that ought to be on the table as we go along. Do globalization processes, fourth issue, left on their own, create competition for scarce resources, while they themselves have no ways to adjudicating or provide means to adjudicating these conflicts? That's one of the issues that Tony Blair has raised. Do we need faiths? Do we need other overarching interpretations of reality to provide framework for adjudicating those conflicts that are caused by the competition for scarce resources? So that's roughly, I think, what we talked about, and that's roughly the issues that remain open. Let me just now briefly summarize where we might be in the session today. The stakes are high in getting the issue of faith and globalization right. That's again the assumption, because faiths are significant even if they're an ambivalent force in the world today. And though faiths are ambivalent in their concrete effects, they have, again, assumption or hypothesis, they have a potential for doing immense good in the world. Two things we mentioned, as I said, fostering reconciliation and humanizing globalization processes. Now, these are preliminary conclusions and or preliminary hypotheses to find out whether they're valid. I think one of the things we need to do is just find a bit more out about what's going on concretely on the ground in the world of faiths. And that's partly what we're trying to do now in this session. So, helicopter is coming a bit more down now. This was a huge stratospheric view that we had before, laden with all sorts of assumptions. We're coming closer to the ground to engage a bit of a descriptive even work and see what's going on in the world of faith. I know that for some of you, that's still not quite close enough to the ground because you're interested in policy issues and things of that sort, and we're still talking about the nature of faiths within the world as we see it within the globalization processes. But we're slowly getting there. I trust you see that. So, states of faith in the world today, that's today also, but also we are interested in the question of tomorrow. What are some of the, how do we extrapolate from today in regards to tomorrow? We're interested in particular in two things: religious adherence. Do faiths continue to claim the hearts and minds of people around the globe as much as they did in the past? Will they do so in the future? And even if we have the numbers, what do these numbers mean? What do they really express? How do we interpret the numbers that we receive in terms of religious adherence? Second issue, we're interested in the public role of faith. Are faiths a force that shapes realities beyond people's private and maybe narrowly communal lives? If so, will they do so also in the future? And if they will, in what ways will faiths be a significant force in the future? I think we're also interested in, and that's the subject for our discussion, topic for our discussion, is the changing character of faiths. How is the character of faiths being shaped and reshaped by globalization processes? Given that changing character, what possibilities of influence on people within globalization processes and what possibilities of influence on globalization processes themselves are there for faiths? So, in a word, we'll try to discern and learn something more about that world of faith. Let me say a few words about faith, about globalization and its relationship to secularization. And the reason why we are immediately bringing in secularization, because secularization thesis seems to be today, in academic circles at least, almost a default position, notwithstanding the almost 50 years of work that Professor Martin has done when he originally resisted that thesis in the 60s, but I think he's winning the day, right? It's clear that globalization is modernization, right? It's fueled by modern economic arrangements. It's mediated by technological advancement, especially of communication. It's assuming and I think reinforcing a very modern phenomenon of individuation. You've seen that especially in some of the readings of Peter Berger that we had for today, and it's fashioning and refashioning alternative global, not quite culture, right? There are plurality of cultures, but something like global subculture, substratum of global culture. Now, so globalization is modernization, but is globalization therefore secularization? Well, if modernization is secularization, then globalization will be secularization as well. But that's really the question. Is modernization equal to secularization? Does it entail decline of religion in society, decline of religion in the minds of individuals? If it does, then obviously globalization will lead to secularization. And if religions do survive, they survive because people hold on to the past caused by either unfinished character of modernization processes. We haven't reached yet the end of modernization when religion will disappear, or maybe by social inertia for a while. And if there may be resurgence of religion, that resurgence will be only the last gasp of religion before its final demise. That's if globalization equals modernization equals secularization. Well, if modernization is not secularization, if there are also religious ways to be modern, and that's the thesis that we are entertaining, that we have been reading about, then embrace of secularism will be just one way to modernize, and embrace of multiple faiths may be alternative ways to modernize. We'll look at that whole question, especially during our next session when we contrast European model with wide variety of other options that are available to us. So in that case, modernization, if it's not secularization, globalization doesn't necessarily lead to secularization. And then the question, I think, remains for us to ask of a more factual nature, well, how religious will the 21st century be? What faiths will thrive and where? What forms will faiths take in that 21st century? Now, I've got a whole bunch of stuff that I need to explore here, and we'll have to do it relatively quickly, summing up some of the issues, I think, that are before us. And that's under the rubric globalization's impact on faith, setting up a stage for our discussion. Now, I think, let me just enumerate relatively quickly a few things. First, globalization is shaping the overarching conditions under which people embrace faith. And one can describe that maybe partially at least as malcontent with globalization processes. People are left out of globalization benefits. People are experiencing injustice on account of globalization processes. People are believing that globalization processes undermine local cultures, or people are experiencing disorientation as a result of globalization processes. People are sensing maybe meaninglessness of the prevalent ends within globalization processes, or people are believing that globalization processes, when driven by market forces, undermine human flourishing. You can go down the list of different reasons why people might then, in contrast, finding themselves caught in globalization processes, choose to embrace faith. Now, that's globalization shaping overarching conditions under which people believe, but globalization is shaping also the very form which faith takes. And there are a number of things that we have found in our reading. One is something like democratization of faiths, which would fit the anti-hierarchical strand in globalization processes themselves. Or globalization might be detaching faiths from particular locales and making them global faiths. That's connected maybe with disembedding characteristics of globalization processes. Maybe rediscovery, almost paradoxically, of the culturally specific forms of faith. Right? There is this global faith, but incarnates itself in particular ways in a given culture. And then there's this phenomenon of smorgasbord religiosity, right? Individually created faith, tailored to individual needs, made from, well, something like nuggets of religious wisdom taken in an ad hoc fashion from whatever source is available and deemed useful, and maybe containing no overarching interpretation of life, and with highly attenuated sense of ultimacy. Religion is here merely useful and not ultimate. And often understood, I think that's probably important, as a matter of personal taste, rather than as a matter of truth claims. What is true, what is good, and what might be beautiful. Globalization is also, that's under C, shaping modes of transmission of faith, technology of delivery, new missionary movements going from east to west. Counter-missions is the term that has been used for that. Re-evangelizing of the West by non-Westerners, missions between non-Western countries. Movement is going every which direction. It's swirling, and it's no longer from the center to the periphery. And finally, globalization may be shaping the modes of religious influence. Globalization shaping faith's forms of engagement with globalization processes themselves. Certain forms of agency are made possible by globalization processes. I'm thinking, say, of the significance of figures representing a large religious institution, Benedict XVI or John Paul II. He could become John Paul II, the world leader, because of globalization processes. Or alternative modes of influence, like charismatic figures who have available at their fingertips, even from a cave, access to influence and communicate with just about everybody on the globe. That becomes another way in which religious faith is disseminated and influence is created. And then finally, in terms of that influence, well, we need to talk about the scope of that influence. All spheres of life, often religions thought of themselves as being regulated all spheres of life. Is that possible under conditions of globalization processes? Such questions, and many alike, we need to explore. You thought helicopter was coming down, right? Well, it is, slowly, come on. Have patience. It will come down. For now, just hovering slightly above maybe comfort zone of some of you. At any rate, those are some of the questions we will explore. We have explored and we will continue to explore. And now I would like to welcome Professor David Martin to address us for, in particular, I think emphasis will be on what he has studied in a unique way. He has studied in a unique way, and that is a question of worldwide Pentecostalism. To introduce him, I'm reminded, is Christy.
Thank you.
Professor David Martin is a Fellow of the British Academy, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at London School of Economics, International Fellow at the Boston University Institute of World Affairs, and sometime Distinguished Professor of Human Values at Southern Methodist University. He is global. He is a regular contributor to the Times Literary Supplement. Many of you may have read his work there, and author of some 20 books. His books and works are concerned with processes of secularization, religion and politics, especially the role of religion in issues of peace and war, violence, and the worldwide surge in Pentecostalism. And he will be having, from what I understand, a forthcoming Times Literary Supplement article on Pentecostalism.
Just out.
Oh, okay.
This week.
Obviously, I haven't read that yet. Which has some impact on our presidential election and one of the vice presidential candidates. So, Professor Martin.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great privilege to be here, and thank you for inviting me. The helicopter is going to hover, and at a slight angle to what you were saying, but I think it can be pulled back into the set of issues that you outlined just now. Like all of us, my background actually shaped my intellectual interests. There has been a long history of exchange of religious capital between England and America, and my grandparents and my father were both swept into a current of American revivalism. And so I was set certain basic questions. There's nothing like a fundamentalist background for having to think hard. And also about peace and violence, because that raised for me the question of the authority of the New Testament with regard to peace and war. So that's why, and also it made me intensely interested in the issue of secularization, because if all my sociological colleagues thought that religion was on the way out, then my parents had made a rather serious mistake. So I had really to examine two things: the question of religion in relation to politics and violence, and was it on the way out? That was the agenda that my background set me. Regarding the first, that is to say, pacifism, peace, and violence, I concluded that there was a strong relation between taking a peace witness and the expectation of the kingdom of God. And that I'm not going to develop now, but I concluded there was a very strong relationship between the two kinds of refusing to fight and expecting the world to be remade in the image of the kingdom of God. But what about secularization? Secularization was perhaps more complicated. I concluded 43 years ago that secularization was both a prescription and a description. The prescription was ideologically inflected, above all by Western rationalism. Basically the notion, almost the eschatological notion, that reason would be triumphant, and you would move from the realm of religious darkness to the realm of rational light. So you see there's already a religious element in the rationalist expectation. It took over the Christian imagery of light. Insofar as it was prescriptive, it involved the notion that one day the whole of the earth would be like either France or Sweden. And the contemporary formulation of that is called is called American exceptionalism. That is, that if all the world one day would be like France or Sweden, then America was somehow the odd one out. And so one had to explain just why America was somehow missed out on the universal road to progress. The other version was that it was the other way round, which is Peter Berger's version, and that's to say that places like France and Sweden are kind of sports in the progress of history, that America's sort of natural and normal, and the odd one out is Europe, and so that's called European exceptionalism. And sociology in this area moves backwards and forwards between thinking the fundamental thing is that America is exceptional, and the other is that Europe is the exceptional one. Okay, once that argument was complete, I decided that I would try and write a more modest general theory of secularization, which was descriptive, from prescription to description. Basically, that was formulated nearly 40 years ago, and it called itself rather grandiosely a general theory of secularization, and it was quite simple. Point one, functional differentiation, that is the separation of autonomous spheres of human activity like education and welfare from ecclesiastical control and the theological modality. But above all, the separation of church and state. That's a major form of functional differentiation, because that frees religion from the obloquy of political power and social status being associated with the elite. But it also allows religion to return as the spirit of the nation, that is to say, as patriotism. Point 2. A lot depends here on the positive or negative relationship of religion to the national myth. As you know, in the United States, it's very positively related to the national myth. Democracy, religion, and America all go together. God bless America. On the other, and that's also true in certain other situations. For example, in Ireland and Poland, where British imperialism and Russian imperialism meant an identification of the nation with Catholicism, a positive relation. Negative relations are France, which emerged in a contest between Catholicism and the spirit of reason, or the Czech Republic and now East Germany. Point 3, a lot depends, and this is more complicated, on whether religion is Protestant evangelical with a strong sense of the individual and individual choice, or Catholic with a strong sense of the community and of territory, and indeed a relationship to power. Power, community, and territory. And I suppose one might slip in Islam here as another case alongside Catholicism as having that particular group of characteristics. Now, whether Catholicism or Protestant evangelicalism aligns itself on the left or the right depends where it is socially situated. For example, in Britain, where Catholicism was a minority, it moved to it largely supported the Labour Party. The same in Australia, where the same conditions obtained, and to some extent, I think, also true in the United States, where there has been, in the past, a tradition of democratic voting by Catholics. Now, evangelicalism, by virtue of this emphasis on choice and the disentanglement from territory, is implicitly pluralistic and lay. It goes back, of course, to the priesthood of all believers. And this has been achieved its major realization in the United States, where it flourishes on competition. So these, if you like, are individual people choosing. This is the model anyway, choosing on a religious market, and doing so in terms of as free, autonomous individuals. Now, Catholicism has often been in the past monopolistic. It hasn't welcomed competition, and that's given rise to radical anti-clericalism. So whereas evangelicalism often can go along with democratization in certain contexts, Catholicism at a particular stage in its development, let me be careful, resisted the breakup of its monopoly and produced very strong counter-movements, especially in Europe. Now, what is the trajectory of evangelical pluralism? It began initially inside the church in Germany. It then broke outside the church in Britain, and it became fully pluralistic in the United States. My argument is that it was finally realized in a decentralized, fissionable form in Pentecostalism, a faith which was dislocated from territory, not connected with political power, indeed often apolitical, and totally decentralized. Decentralized lay, based on choice, separated from territory and from power, and in that sense highly adapted to the modern global situation. So we have actually arrived at globalization at last. Okay. Choice versus birthright, voluntary association versus territorial monopoly. Remember that in most European countries, 80% of the population notionally belongs to one particular church. So that's the third and rather complicated element of the theory. The fourth element has to do with empirical correlations, which I won't bother you with, such as the bigger the city, the smaller the degree of religious participation, the more heavy industry, the smaller the degree of religious participation, and the universal gender difference, which, by the way, is very important. Okay, so those were the elements in the theory. Okay, function differentiation, the relationship to the national myth, whether it was the particular form that's related to Protestant evangelicalism or in relation to Catholicism, and then finally the various empirical correlations which could all be worked through these historical variations. QED. What about Pentecostalism? Pentecostalism has now displaced Eastern Orthodoxy as the second largest sector of Christianity. And it runs parallel with, I have written down here, it is a rival with Islamic revivalism. Its origins go back to Methodism, especially the holiness tradition. And if you look at my Times Literary Supplement article, it spells all this out. And to movements which realize the free availability of spiritual gifts to all. Gifts to all. As it broke out in Los Angeles in 1906 with William Seymour, a black preacher, there were scenes of interracial enthusiasm. And it combined white and black revivalism. What did that mean? It meant that it was pre-adapted to spread in the Third World. In a way that wasn't really available to mainstream Christianity. Mainstream Christianity seemed to be something partially alien, but Pentecostalism, because it already had these elements in it, was pre-adapted to the developing world. And so all those other elements that I've mentioned about decentralization, deterritorialization, all those other things were combined with this further element of pre-adaptation. Pluralistic, fissile, disconnected from territory, pre-adapted. And that helped it to spread in a transnational, multicultural society. And whereas Methodism had mobilized the masses in the Industrial Revolution as they made their way to the industrial city, so Pentecostalism mobilizes the masses on a global scale on their way to the global mega city. It's interesting that of the two possible women that might have become President of the United States, one, Hillary Clinton, was a Methodist, okay, so she was at that stage, and the other, Sarah Palin, is a Pentecostal. So my little sequence is actually paralleled by Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin. Now, to whom does Pentecostalism appeal? It appeals to buried peoples, marginalized whole peoples, which is surprising if it's not territorial. But it does manage to do that in the Andes, and it appeals to European gypsies, for example. One, it appeals to women. Why? Because it reforms men and brings them back into a disciplined, monogamous family. it also appeals to what I call a buried intelligentsia. That is, to highly energetic, intelligent men who don't, who would actually be filtered through the normal educational system, but in fact become religious captains of industry. It is not true that all the intelligent people in the world go through universities and get PhDs, as we discussed over lunch. In fact, there are other avenues in which people, as it were, work out their personal salvation. And this is a remarkable set of men that run these religious, that are religious captains of industry. They set up as religious entrepreneurs, and they run organizations that are autonomous social capital based on no alcohol, no drugs, no smoking, no women at the weekend, no going from one family to another and leaving the children with one woman after another. And of course, this is one reason why it appeals to women, because if you go to a Pentecostal church and these are the standards, these are the criteria of membership, this means that the stability of their family, which is essential to women, is secure. So I have actually called Pentecostalism the global women's trade union. People have said to me, can you really prove that you get social mobility through Pentecostalism? And I simply say, if you give up drugs, alcohol, women, and then you engage in hard work and have a disciplined family life, that those things automatically, you don't need further evidence. You can work it out for yourselves. But also in the Pentecostal churches, you have an autonomous form of social capital that provides you with training to get on. So you're not simply running your own organization. You're also building in business schools, or in Nigeria, you'd be building in perhaps a community bank. So it's an all-embracing environment. Finally, how am I for time, by the way? Where's my 5-minute man? I've got, all right. So how does it relate to the religious right in the US? And what about neo-Pentecostalism? This is just about right. I don't claim to be an expert on the religious right in the US, but I think it's a pity if Pentecostalism is just assimilated to fundamentalism. The important element is the availability of spiritual gifts to everybody. Now, evangelicalism and Pentecostalism both have mixed political records, and this is characteristic of all religions, because the political stances that religions take depend on where they are socially located. Not straightforwardly on their religious repertoire, but how their social location encourages them to pick particular parts of their religious repertoire for use in particular situations. So evangelicalism itself is bound to be politically ambiguous, moving between this position and that position. All the same, it was historically associated with anti-slavery, and black evangelicalism was associated with the civil rights movement. Now, it seems to me that in the 60s convulsions, moral convulsions, psychological convulsions, brought out a long-term strain in evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, worrying about moral deterioration. That there was a shift to more explicitly towards the right. And one of the elements in this was, what is it to be womanly? What is it to be manly, if I dare use the word manly? And my thesis is that somebody like Sarah Palin actually fits into people who want to ask that particular question. At the same time, there's been a move within evangelicalism which is out of this kind of political ghetto, a broader perspective emerging, and evangelical intelligentsia as well as the tele-evangelists. Remember that both Obama and Palin have strong evangelical roots, and they both have pastor trouble. So finally, yes, global neo-Pentecostalism. Neo-Pentecostalism. Now, the Americans have never been ashamed of prosperity, so it's not surprising that you could have a health and wealth gospel where prosperity is a sign of being blessed. At the same time, the African and I would say the Latin American religious imagination relate the goods to the gods. Not only that, if you read the Hebrew scriptures, which these people do avidly, they find there's an upbeat version which says, you know, that the poor, that the righteous will not want for bread. The righteous shall not want for bread. So I've daringly called this movement Afro-Jewish. And what does it do? It combines two things. On the one hand, at the level of the megachurch, and I'm not talking about all the hundreds of little churches that honeycomb the downtown areas of cities all over the world. I'm now talking about the megachurches. What does it do? It combines the organization of the corporation plus the provision of autonomous social capital for the masses. And it is almost anywhere and everywhere, and it moves from south to south and north to south and south to north exactly in the way that was explained earlier, so that you have the center of Kiev, the Embassy of God, founded by a Nigerian who went to Russia to learn Marxism and ended up by founding a megachurch in Kiev. If that's not globalization, I don't know what is. So, on the one hand, the small churches of the little people that honeycomb poor areas all over the world, and on the other hand, these mega churches, autonomous social capital, empowerment, and especially empowerment for women. Thank you very much.